Well, hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. If this is your first time listening to Loving the Scriptures, welcome, and I want to thank you for joining us on this journey of going through God's Word, which right now, on this podcast, we were going through the Gospel of John, but over the past few weeks, we've taken a break from the book of John and spent a few weeks talking about the attributes of God, and now we're ready to get right back into things here by starting John chapter 7. We got a lot of territory to cover, so we're just going to get right into it here as quickly as possible. So let's do this. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. Yeah, so it's been a little bit. Like I said, we've taken the last few weeks to start on the subject of the attributes of God, which if you've been listening over the past few episodes, you know that is something that we're going to do, pulling from that sermon series that I did at my church, preaching on the attributes of God and doing at least one of those whenever we take a break in the book of John. So we looked at this, we did an introductory sermon and then 2 episodes on the sovereignty of God, part 1 and part 2. So I hope that that has been profitable for you. And we've got a lot more goodness to go as it relates to all of that. And I think I mentioned last time, I mentioned that the next one that's coming up that we're going to look at is the holiness of God. So be ready for that when we take a break. Again, I don't know exactly when we're going to take that break. I mean, as far as our study of the book of John, probably not going to be after we finish chapter 7. We'll probably do chapter 7 and then probably delve into chapter 8 as well, is what I'm thinking. And then maybe possibly when we get done with chapter 8, we'll go ahead and take another break, talk about something else, and then include within that break one of those episodes being the sermon on the holiness of God. But again, that's just my faint thinking at the moment. Don't write that in stone. We might take a totally different course as it relates to all of that. But before we get into everything related to the book of John, let me remind you that if you enjoy this program and you haven't done so already, please go ahead and follow and subscribe to my show wherever you listen to this podcast. Also, follow me on X. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And also, don't forget to order a copy of my book, if you haven't done so already, Signs of the End: What Did Jesus Say About His Own Return and the Events That Point to It? A study of Jesus' words to his disciples in the Olivet Discourse, Mark 13, Matthew 24, and Luke 21. As usual, I'll leave links in the episode description, so it'll take you to the order pages. I hope you order a copy. I hope you read it, and I hope that you're blessed by it. Okay, now today as we get back into the book of John, and we're picking up right where we left off. We're getting ready to get into John chapter 7. Like I said, I'm gonna try and cover quite a bit of territory here. Chapter 7 is also just like chapter 6 is a lengthy chapter, not as lengthy, but still pretty lengthy. It's almost as lengthy as chapter 6, but not quite. But the goal here for this episode in starting out chapter 7 is to look at the first 24 verses of that chapter. So that's quite a bit of real estate to look at. That's why I said let's go ahead and get into this so that we can start covering some territory here and see what we can come up with. But just as a reminder, though, because it has been a few weeks since we've been in the book of John. Remember where we left off last time. And if you haven't been with us last time, or you haven't been with us throughout the study of the book of John, that's okay. If you want to pick up on some things that we've talked about previously, you can go back and listen to any of those episodes that you want to, even the ones specifically having to do with the chapter we just got out of, which is John chapter 6. We did a good, I want to say, 6 episodes in John chapter 6, because again, chapter 6 is a lengthy chapter, and there's a lot of things that are pretty involved in there. I mean, even as Jesus talks about the bread of life and some things you have to say, okay, what's he meaning here, and what significance would this have to the people that he's speaking to? And even what significance would that have to us today as readers reading this? Because by extension, these are words to us as well. And what significance and what sort of meaning do we take in those words? But anyway, I don't want to digress or anything. But if you remember, if you've been with us, and let's just take a quick minute or two to remind ourselves where we've been, specifically in chapter 6. Chapter 6, we've been in the northern part of Israel, in the area of Galilee, and we looked at Jesus. We started out by looking at Jesus in his multiplication of the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, which served as a springboard for everything else that we saw in that chapter. Mainly Jesus talking about himself as the bread of life. And really, when you examine Jesus's words, that's just a further declaration from our Savior himself of him identifying himself as God. And one of the things that we see is that after the miracle, while you have people who were, responded positively, at least outwardly, to what Jesus did, they were ready to make him king by force. But by the time we get to the end of the chapter, all except for the 12 deserted him. Okay, so he performed the miracle. He goes across to the other side of on the other side of the lake, and the next day everybody's wondering where he went. So they go and seek him, and they find him. And Jesus is saying, pretty much as one who knows their heart, says, you're seeking me for the wrong reasons, and that sort of thing. And what you see are further challenges from the crowd, the same crowd who was ready to make him king, but based on the claims that he's making about himself. He's saying, they were essentially saying, you need to do better than that. Do you measure up to the level of Moses and what he did for the people of Israel in the wilderness? And Jesus is one who essentially says, not only am I better than Moses, but I have a greater impact on a greater number of people than Moses. Because while Moses was one who led the people of Israel, Jesus is one who gives bread to the whole world so that they may have life. Okay. And so we ran into a lot of other things about belief and unbelief, God's sovereignty in the midst of all of this, and even talking about the necessity of receiving him and his sacrifice, which was described in a manner of talking about, what Jesus said about eating my flesh and drinking my blood. Which isn't a nod towards cannibalism, and it's not anything that was a foundational structure for the Lord's Supper later on, nor for transubstantiation or anything like that. Again, we talked about that before, but it's about receiving him and accepting the sacrifice which he would do for his people. Again, remember we saw that was something that he spoke in the future tense, and that, in addition to everything else that Jesus was saying, was something that the crowd just couldn't handle. And he said, this is a hard saying. Who can accept it? And so they turn around and desert him. Okay. Now, again, just remember comparing that and comparing that with what we saw in chapter 5. And what we saw in chapter 5, and reminding ourselves of that, is going to be important because Jesus is going to bring it up here momentarily in the passage that we're going to look at. In chapter 5, we're in the southern region in Judea, and specifically in Jerusalem. Jesus heals the invalid, and because he did that on the Sabbath, he starts to get guff from people, and he makes a declaration of being God by saying, my Father has been working until now, and I am working. And so they said that they sought all the more to kill him because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was making himself equal with God by calling God his Father. So you see a kind of a more drastic sort of attitude in the southern region, and that's going to play in a little bit to what we see even as we get initially into these initial verses here in the book of John. But again, that's kind of what you have there. And so when we get into chapter 7, we're going to be going back to Jerusalem because there's another feast at hand here. So let's without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this. And what I'll do, normally what I've been doing throughout this study is reading the whole section of what we're going to be looking at, but you notice I didn't do that. We'll just take this and read it according to section, and I want to divide this chapter into 2 sections. one having to do with Jesus before he goes to the feast, and then the second section being when he's at the feast and he starts teaching at the temple. Okay, so let's start the first section here, and I'll read that, which is verses 1 through 13. All right, and so this is what it says here in that section. It says, after this being, everything that we looked at in John chapter 6, and the massive rejection from the crowd that walked away from him, except for the 12. It says, after this, Jesus went about in Galilee. He would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Now the Jews' feast of booths was at hand. So his brothers said to him, leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works that you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world. For not even his brothers believed in him. Jesus said to them, my time has not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. You go up to the feast. I am not going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come. After saying this, he remained in Galilee. But after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. The Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, where is he? And there was much muttering about him among the people. While some said, he is a good man, others said, no, he is leading the people astray. Yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. Okay, so those are the first 13 verses, and that's the first section that I want to cover here as we delve into this chapter of chapter 7. So this is Jesus before the feast, right before the feast. So it says that Jesus stays there in Galilee. He says after this, in verse 1, after this he went about in Galilee. So he's still in Galilee. Where we were in chapter 6 was also in Galilee, and so he stays there and doesn't go to Judea, because it says that the Jews, he would not go about in Judea because the Jews were seeking to kill him. Okay, so the Jews wanted to kill him, and again that harkens our mind back to what we saw in chapter 5, and specifically in that chapter, it's verse 18. So in Galilee, they had, if we just compare the difference there, again, that I just mentioned a few minutes ago, in Galilee, they just walked away from him. Okay, but they didn't seek to kill him. Okay, so that's kind of the situation that you have there. Now, the impression that you get in these introductory verses of chapter 7 is that Jesus was still doing works, like miraculous works. And we'll get into this a little bit here in a minute, but Jesus isn't just sitting idle, while he's in Galilee. He's avoiding Judea for now, but in Galilee, he's not sitting idle. He's still doing works. There's quite a bit of detail that you'd see when you do a comparison and fill in the gaps from what you see within the synoptics. And the number of chapters escapes me, but specifically even in the book of Luke, there's a large chunk in here that you can probably fit in here between John chapter 6 and John chapter 7 here, which highlights his works of that he does in Galilee, and even his starting to go to Judea, to Jerusalem to celebrate this feast. Okay, but he was still doing works. And it says there back in chapter 7 in verse 2, it says, now the Jews' feast of booths was at hand. And this is another term that is used here that you might be familiar with, is the Feast of Tabernacles. If you wanted to read from the Old Testament, just kind of references to that. Specifically, you see that in Leviticus chapter 23, verses 33 through 43. And so that's the celebration is at hand. And it celebrated God's provision and protection for his people. And throughout this feast week, which lasted 8 days, you had food offerings that were brought on each of those days, and you also had people who lived in booths or tents, just as their fathers had done when they were in the wilderness. Okay, and so that's the festival that is about to take place. So you're going to have a lot of Jews who are at least in Galilee, who will make a mass exodus from the north part and make their way to the south, to Judea, to celebrate this all important feast. Okay, and so the Feast of Booths is at hand. So in verse 3 it says, "So his brothers said to him, 'Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." Okay, that's verses 3 and 4. So here you see, and what we have to understand here, and you get the sense of this in verse 5, the little commentary note that John provides there in verse 5. It says, "For not even his brothers believed in him." So we understand there, just from that note from John, that Jesus's brothers aren't operating on some sort of mindset of helping out their brother to make him more known so that he can be glorified as the God-man as he is. These were brothers who were mocking him. They were mocking Jesus because they didn't believe in him. Okay, so essentially what they're saying in all of that, it says, don't limit your works to just Galilee. And again, remember, the things that if you understand Jesus' Galilean ministry, we understand that he's doing miraculous works, even after what we've seen with the 5 loaves and the 2 fish. And even though you had a large crowd of people who turned away from him, he's still doing miraculous works. And his brothers know this. And so essentially what they're saying is that don't limit your works, your miraculous deeds, to Galilee. Because if you just limit yourself just to Galilee, then, you're not really going to get a lot of attention. Don't you want a lot of attention? And again, you gotta imagine that this is said with a tone and a mindset of mocking. Okay. So essentially they're saying, not many people, if you limit yourself here to just Galilee, will see you. So you need to go to Judea, and specifically going to Judea during the time of the feast, to put yourself out in the open. Okay, that's really what they're saying here. And he says, if you do these things, this is in the middle of verse 4. It says, if you do these things, show yourself to the world. Okay, so the brothers, and listen, by the way, the brothers don't deny that Jesus' works. All right. Now I don't know if they've been specific eyewitnesses at this point of anything that Jesus was doing miraculously, but I would imagine that at least by word of mouth, they're hearing, from many people, what Jesus is doing, and so that's why they're able to say, if you want to do these works, don't limit yourself to just Galilee. Go to Judea. That's where it really counts. That's where, especially you got many of the religious leaders who are down there. That's where people who are more religiously astute and everything like that, that's where they're housed. And especially if you go down there to the feast, you're going to have an even wider audience. So why limit yourself to just Galilee? Go down there in Judea. Nobody who wants to be a public figure just sticks around here. Go to where you can really make a name for yourself. Okay. But again, the brothers don't necessarily deny Jesus's works. They don't deny that Jesus is doing miraculous things. And that's even true of many other Jesus's enemies, specifically within the leadership. Now, at some points, you'll have people who would deny that Jesus did any miraculous works. I believe we're going to see that a little bit later, a couple of chapters later in John chapter 9, as it relates to the man born blind. But again, even if you think about much later than that, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, his enemies, you see, and specifically at the end of Matthew, you see that they don't deny that the resurrection actually happened, but they make up a story that they know isn't true, to cover their tracks and everything, in collaboration with the Roman soldiers. And they told a tale that spread throughout the whole land about what happened to Jesus's body. Not that he rose from the dead, but they knew that he rose from the dead. But here, it seems like they have at least some sort of a knowledge or an understanding that Jesus is doing certain works. And they're not denying that. They're not denying that. Yet they still, like many of Jesus's enemies, they still did not believe. Okay? So what we see here, and again, going back to verse 5, is saying not even his brothers believed in him. So they have a knowledge that Jesus is doing miraculous works, and they still don't believe. What we have here with everything that they're saying to Jesus, this is them suggesting, in a certain sense, that he was not as big as he made himself out to be. In other words, I mean, if we want to take it to its grandest, sort of thought, he's not God. I mean, his brothers didn't believe that he was God, even though Jesus himself claimed to be God. So they're pretty much suggesting that he was not as big as he made himself out to be. So because if he was who he said he was, then he'd be in front of everybody, making himself known, not just going around in the fringes of Galilee. So there you can maybe even sense to a certain degree that his brothers, had strong doubts and saying, if you're really who you say you are, and if you're really as big as you make yourself out to be, then why aren't you out there, in front of a lot larger and more significant audience instead of just hanging around here in Galilee? But again, what they're saying is they're prodding him in a spirit of doubt. And again, like I said before, in a certain sense, it's their way of mocking him and saying, kind of indirectly, kind of suggesting your behavior and your strategy and going about the way that you have kind of suggests that you're not as big as you make yourself out to be. And that's their expression of unbelief. Okay. Now, how does Jesus respond to this? How does he go into this here? We see in verse 5 that, not even his brothers believed in him, which, by the way, if you're familiar with Scripture, we know that that's going to be a complete reversal by the time we get to post-resurrection, right? And you can look specifically at Acts 1:14 when you have the disciples gathered there with the women, and also who does it say that's there? Jesus' brothers there together with the group to pray. James says that the Lord appeared to him, and we have James, the brother of Jesus, who writes a book of the New Testament, as does his other brother Jude as well. So again, we here in John chapter 7 we see unbelief, but later on we're going to see a reversal of that, and his brothers actually do believe. And in fact, James is one who actually is martyred for the Christian faith. That gives you any idea of his devotion and everything like that. But so Jesus' response to his brothers, his unbelieving brothers at this point, in verse 6, Jesus said to them, "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here." Okay? So when he's talking about my time, and he starts mentioning this thing about my time, and even narratively in other parts of this chapter, it's going to talk about, and I think maybe even in other future chapters here in John, it's going to be talking about Jesus's time or Jesus's hour not yet coming or not being here. Even here as we're introduced to it here in chapter 7, we get another sense of the sovereignty of God, which is interesting, just given what we started to look at in the Attributes of God series, even before coming into this time in John chapter 7. God is one who has everything in control, and Jesus is one who says, "My time has not yet come." Now, you can look at this in a couple of senses when he says, "My time has not yet come." In one sense, it's in relation to the overall glory that he would receive from men, because his brothers are saying, show yourself to the whole world and, get your love and adoration from them, essentially. And Jesus is one who's saying that will happen. It's just not going to be now. Now, there will be a time, as Scripture says elsewhere, where every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, right? So that is coming, and that will happen, but it's going to be at another time. So in a sense, you see it in reference to that. But in a second sense, I think that this whole thing of Jesus saying, "My time has not yet come," is in relation to his going to the feast. So even in a more immediate context, and he says, as he goes on to say there in verse 6, "But your time is always here." So for his brothers, essentially saying, for you guys, my brothers, any time is right. In other words, any time that goes by your own understanding is the right way and the right timing, which their own way, their own thinking, their own timing is their own, but it doesn't line up with the divine plan that is already laid out, in which Jesus himself is already following, right? And so his brothers can have this thought in their mind of saying, if you are who you say you are, why don't you do this? Or why don't you go up now? And that sort of thing. Jesus is one who lets them in on the fact is that your thinking and your way of strategizing is not based on anything that's divinely laid out. So here we have Jesus, who is one who follows to the letter the will of God in heaven, to the will of his Father, and that is the timetable that he works with, based on the sovereignty of God and his sovereign plan in all of this, not by his own brothers. And he says, for you, any time is right, essentially. Okay. Now, as he goes on to say, as he goes into verse 7, it says, the world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. Okay. Now, by this, you notice here, by this, Jesus identifies his brothers as people who are part of the world. I mean, just kind of it almost seems kind of subtle, but at the same time, maybe not so subtle. You know, he said, the world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. So here we have Jesus and we have his brothers. They're working on two totally different playing fields. The world, which is against Jesus, are ones who can't hate his brothers because they're working on the same playing field. Not so with Jesus. It's a different playing field that they're working on. And the main contributing factor of that is that Jesus testifies that their works are evil. So Jesus identifies his brothers as ones who are being part of the world. In other words, outside of that religious circle, even though they practice religion, because they themselves are going to be ones who go up to Jerusalem, they're going to celebrate the feast and everything like that. So even though they have a semblance of outward religion in their lives, Jesus is one who suggests by these words that they're part of the world. And as part of the world, they love them, right? They're a part of them. And so the world can't hate you. It's kind of along the same lines, kind of expressed in a different form. And we'll get to this much later in the book of John, but in chapter 15, as part of Jesus's upper room discourse, and in verses 18 and 19, it says, if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world, the world would love you as its own, but because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. Okay, so you kind of have the, kind of a similar, thing being stated as Jesus is talking to his disciples and saying that the world will hate you because I've chosen you out of the world. Okay, here as it stands for his brothers in chapter 7 in their unbelief. Now, I believe that, now that we know what's going to happen with their brothers and that they will become ones who believe, they will become people who the world doesn't hate and be transformed into people that the world will actually hate. And again, as I mentioned before, James is a case in point where he is one who actually will end up being martyred for the faith and for his devotion to his brother, the Lord Jesus Christ. So that's a pretty big statement to make about them. But again, given what's revealed to us in the text itself about the unbelief of his brothers, it's not too surprising. But again, even, considering things further, just going to Judea isn't, as simple. I mean, because the brothers are saying, just go to Judea and show yourself to the world and everything. It's not as simple when people want you dead, because again, as it said, it was said narratively, the Jews in Judea were seeking to kill him. Okay. So, I mean, just taking that advice of just going there isn't as simple when people want you dead, when people are trying to kill you. But even taking more of the phrase of what we have here, where, not only does he say that the world can't hate you, it says, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. And that's something, whether you're talking about Jew or Gentile or anybody else, that's something that can get people riled up. I mean, because a lot of people, even non-religious people, I mean, even people in our nation, in our society today, many people will dub themselves as good people. So if you were one who were to speak with them and declare to them that their works are actually evil and that what they do comes from an evil and wicked heart, that's going to rub a lot of people the wrong way. And you'll have people say maybe not so nice things about you, or maybe try and do some things to you. But in a general sense, people don't like to be told about their sin or the fact that they engage in wickedness. Now, I mean, put yourself in the sandals of the typical religious Jew. You have a lot of people within that culture who they see themselves, as best as they can, dotting every I and crossing every T. They might not be perfect at it. They might look at the religious leaders and think they have it more together than we do, but we're doing everything to the best of our ability to keep the law and everything like that. So when people come around and start saying that our ways are evil, when we're in our eyes doing what is given us according to the law, we're not going to like hearing that, and we're not going to like you because you're saying all of these things, and even, you get a sense of his talking about their works being evil. When you go back to, and I'll just call your attention to this real quick. Remember in John chapter 5, so go back a couple of chapters, in verses 28 and 29, remember when he says, where he says, "Do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come out, those who have done good to the resurrection of life, and those who have done evil to the resurrection of judgment." Right? Now, those of Christ, those who are, not of Christ, rather, will be judged. I mean, if we take everything in context, even what we're talking about there in that chapter, that's the sense that you get. So even if you have people in John chapter 5, the people that Jesus is talking to who are not of him, Jesus is one who's essentially saying that when the resurrection comes, if you're not of me and you're not in me, there's going to be a resurrection, but those who have done evil, that is you, will go to the resurrection of judgment. All right. So you have people there, and again, in that southern region, who have heard that from Jesus's mouth, and heard that from Jesus's lips before. Okay. So that's what you have there. So he testifies that their deeds are evil. So here's the thing: doing works, in other words, miraculous works, Jesus doing miraculous works has nothing to do with changing wicked hearts. Okay. They're brothers, even though in a mocking sort of way, saying, "Hey, why don't you just go to Galilee, Judea and everything like that, and whatever, and perform, and make yourself known and do those things there for a wider audience." Essentially, another thing to factor into this is that, Jesus, in addition to doing works, speaks the truth about man's true spiritual condition. And their true spiritual condition is outlined in saying that you are wicked and evil. Now, because they have wicked and evil hearts that buck against the righteousness of God, then again, in their self-denial, they're not going to like that. So even if you do perform miracles, which Jesus has done, not only in chapter 5, but even remember in places like chapter 2, the performance of miracles and just putting on a show or a performance isn't going to do anything that changes wicked hearts. Now, I think that God can use miracles in addition to the work that he does in somebody's heart, combine them together to bring about true life. But you have to understand that if we're just doing this as far as from a mindset of just perform these miracles and people will be convinced, if you're dealing with a wicked heart from which proceeds evil and wicked people, then it's not just a matter of doing works. Doing works, miraculous works, does nothing to change wicked hearts. Okay, they saw his works, again, John chapter 5, and they hate him because of what he said and claimed of himself. Okay, so that's what you have there. So continuing on in verse 8, it says, "You go to the feast. I am not going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come." Okay, so Jesus says that he's not going, and in some I guess it depends on what translation you have. Some people some translations within that text might have the word "yet," where he says that I am not yet going up to this feast. In my ESV here, there's a footnote. The yet appears in a footnote, not in the main actual text. But that's because there are later manuscripts where in that particular part of the text, it has, maybe like a scribe or somebody may have added the word yet there. And the reason why they do that is possibly to, again, like I said, is probably addition from a later scribe to explain the apparent contradiction that shows up there. Because if we just say that I am not going up to the feast, and then we see later that Jesus does go to the feast, then people, and this has actually been an objection even from ancients back in the day, who are familiar with this and saying, okay, well, doesn't that paint Jesus out to be a liar? And so when people have added the word yet, and again, don't let that bother you too much, because even what we have here, there's the integrity enough to say or to suggest that not all manuscripts have this. Okay. And a lot of people are honest about this and will say that the more accurate reading of this text is the ones that don't have the word yet. The earlier manuscripts don't have that. And for anybody who may have added that yet, they weren't necessarily doing it for nefarious purposes, but they were using it to explain, this whole thing of where Jesus says, I'm not going to the feast. And then it says he goes to the feast later on, because then people will say, well, Jesus is just yanking their chain. He's just lying and that sort of thing. And there's this contradiction. Now, here's the thing. I just don't want to spend too much time on this, but, at least just for some things to consider as it relates to this. Jesus not going to the feast, and then him going could be just a matter of him saying he's not going up with his brothers, or as the tradition went with a lot of Galileans, there was a large caravan that would go from Galilee in the north to the south. And so, either, with his brothers specifically or with the caravan more broadly, perhaps going with his brothers or with that caravan would have made him initially easy to find, and thus easy to kill for those people who were seeking to kill him. Especially if people were familiar with his brothers, or within that caravan, having an eye out, with the arrival of that caravan and seeing where Jesus is within that, so that they would be identified and then they would be able to kill him. But as it says there, after he says, I'm not going up to this feast, for my time is not yet fully come. It says there in verse 9, after saying this, he remained in Galilee. So there was a period of time where he did not go. He remained in Galilee, okay? But then, as it says in verse 10, but after his brothers had gone up, so this is after a period of time, and after his brothers had left and gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. Now, the whole thing of, if we're talking about not drawing attention to himself, which may have been the case if he went with his brothers or with the caravan, that would explain where he goes privately. And privately, by the way, doesn't mean by himself. I mean, if you do a comparison with the synoptics, I think the suggestion is that he went with other people, specifically with his disciples. He went with less attention on himself. And this combined with the fact that he didn't go immediately so that he would be there at the beginning of the feast, the feast has already started by then, by the time he does appear publicly. So the whole thing is that he doesn't go up to the feast. He doesn't go up to the feast publicly initially. And possibly what the meaning behind that also is publicly with his brothers, where he would be easily initially found either by the people who were trying to kill him or by the crowd who was looking for him as well. Okay. Now, here's another thing to consider, and we'll lay this out and then we'll continue on with the text. But consider the whole thing here is that, because again, people might accuse Jesus of being a liar in this passage, in this text. If he's saying, I'm not going to the feast, and then he goes to the feast, let's ask this question. Why would Jesus lie and tell his brothers that he's not going to the feast when he has every intention of publicly teaching? Because again, in the middle of the feast, he makes himself publicly known and starts to teach. When he has every intention of publicly teaching and would thus be easily discoverable by his brothers. I mean, if he's trying to pull the wool over his brother's eyes and saying he's not going to the feast, and then he goes to the feast, you would think that if he's trying to deceive them, that he would do everything within his power so that his brothers wouldn't know that he was there at all during the whole time. But if his intention was to teach publicly this whole time, albeit in the middle of the feast, then that's, why would he lie to his brothers and then proceed to do things that would make him easily discoverable to his brothers, so his brothers knew that he was lying? That really doesn't make a whole lot of sense in my mind. So, the whole thing of the later, the probable later addition by a scribe of the word yet, even though it's not original to the actual manuscript, does accurately describe the sense of the text there. Jesus saying, I'm not yet going to the feast, because he's clearly going to the feast, and he is clearly going to make himself publicly known, and his brothers would have even known that as well. And so that makes it less sense for this to be a lie to his brothers. It just doesn't add up there. So as it says there, he stayed there in Galilee for a little while, but then in verse 10, but after his brothers had gone up to the feast, then he also went up, not publicly, but in private. Now, here's the thing: as you get into the verse 11, people were looking for him. Not necessarily. I mean, maybe some of the people who are looking to do him harm, but even other people surrounding that as well. In verse 11, the Jews were looking for him at the feast and saying, "Where is he?" Now, again, when it says Jews in the book of John, usually that means that refers to Jesus' enemies, specifically people that were coming from the leadership. So perhaps they were looking for him to see if they could find some way to get to him, to arrest him, and that sort of thing. But even surrounding that, you have other people who are asking about him as well. Okay, so Jesus, in some sense, from different people, is the talk of the town. The crowd expected Jesus to be there. All right. He had taught and performed miracles in Jerusalem before, and certainly had left an impression if they were looking for him, whether for ill or for some other reasons. Okay. And here we see divided perspectives about Jesus. So it says there in verse 12, and there was much muttering about him among the people, while some said he is a good man, others said no, he is leading the people astray. Okay, so there you have divided perspectives. Now note, one of those perspectives come from people who say that he is a good man. Okay, understand that on the surface, while that might sound good, that's still something that falls short. And while Jesus is good, that's, it's more than Jesus being good. Jesus is more than just a good man. He's God in human flesh, right? And that's what he's been displaying of himself and claiming of himself all along. It's kind of along the same lines as people today who say that Jesus was a good teacher. He was a good moral teacher. And that's all they say about Jesus. And usually a lot of people who say that are people who aren't familiar with the Bible or even specifically the Gospels, because if they were, you would understand that it's more than just being a good moral teacher, right? And so the same thing along the similar lines here. Just because they're saying, some people are saying he's a good man, doesn't mean that their thoughts went far or deep enough as it related to who Jesus Christ truly is. Now, there were others, as it says there, who says that he leads the people astray. And of course, when you have somebody like Jesus who does what he does on the Sabbath and healing people and claiming to be God, in their minds, it's obvious to them that he's leading people astray because he's going outside of those boundaries as it relates to the law and specifically of the Sabbath. Okay. But notice where it says there, it says, yet for fear of the Jews, no one spoke openly of him. Okay, and that would even include those people who are, I believe, those people who are saying that he leads people astray. So even those people who are saying those things, I think, understood, just the intensity of the Jewish leaders' hatred for Jesus, and perhaps out of fear of anybody even hearing them talking about Jesus, even though it would be in the negative. For fear of saying, hey, you're talking about Jesus. What's up with that sort of thing? They were ones who wanted to do this as privately. They didn't discuss these things out in the open streets or anything like that. For fear of the Jews. and that sort of thing. So even they were guarded in some of the things that they said about Jesus. So here we get to the second portion here of our text. So starting in verse 14. So let me read verses 14 through 24, where it says, "About the middle of the feast, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. The Jews therefore marveled, saying, 'How is it that this man has learning when he has never studied?' So Jesus answered them, 'My teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. If anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. The one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. Has not Moses given you the law? Yet none of you keeps the law. Why do you seek to kill me?' The crowd answered, 'You have a demon. Who is seeking to kill you?' Jesus answered them, 'I did one work, and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision, not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers, and you circumcise a man on the Sabbath. If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision, so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well? Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment." Okay, let's see if we can get through the rest of this in a reasonable amount of time here. So here we see that Jesus goes and he now appears publicly. And it says in the middle of the week. So we're talking maybe about day 4 of this week-long celebration of the Feast of Booths, where Jesus makes his appearance. About the middle of the week, verse 14, Jesus went up into the temple and began teaching. And of course, Jesus was one who was a rabbi, and he's taught in there before, so that's kind of a natural place for him to go when he starts to teach, is to go to the designated teaching places in the temple where he could start teaching. Okay. And in verse 15, it says, "The Jews therefore marveled, saying, 'How is it that this man has learning when he has never studied?'" Okay. And I don't think that this is something, it says that they marvel, but I don't think this is a marveling in a positive sense, and saying necessarily that, that this is something to be amazed at. We know that he hasn't gone to school, and therefore, but he has all of these smart things and intelligent and wise things to say. This is truly amazing. Maybe to a certain degree, maybe that is the case with some of the people, maybe. But again, what we're dealing with here is the Jews. And again, with that designation usually is talking about Jesus' enemies. And so I think really what you're dealing with here with the Jews who are saying these things, it's a way of pointing these things out so that people don't take Jesus seriously. Jesus has, in other words, it's saying, Jesus has no learning. And even their use of the word "this man," how is it that this man right here has learning? The term "this man" might, the way that they use it might be a term expressed in a way of expressing disrespect. But it says the Jews are not taking him seriously because he didn't come from the right formal training, whether from a noted rabbi or somebody else, or they didn't go to the right rabbinical school, because he doesn't have any of those credentials that so many of the respected rabbis would have, who people love and take seriously. And, one thing that you'll notice is that he doesn't quote other rabbis. He speaks on his own authority. These are people who are putting this whole thing of Jesus not having any formal learning in order to not take him seriously. They're using that as an excuse and saying that, how is it that this man has all this learning? They're almost being sarcastic, I think, is the sense that you can pick up from this. And he's not having studied. So in other words, the message to the crowd is, you don't need to take this person seriously. Now, this shows, I think, to a certain degree, just how hard of a heart that people can have. Because even if we look beyond Jesus and we think about somebody like the Apostle Paul, when he was Saul and before his conversion, was somebody who had great training under Rabbi Gamaliel, who was top notch in that day. And then, of course, after he comes to the Lord Jesus Christ and the gospel is revealed to him directly from Jesus Christ himself, according to Galatians chapter 1, what happens? You have a lot of people who don't take him seriously. And in fact, they want to do away with him, right? So there, in that case, you had somebody who was very well studied, but yet when speaking gospel truth, they still didn't take him seriously and wanted to do away with him. So really, at the end of the day, you're dealing with something, a deeper issue that's going on here. And that's pretty obvious, since we know just from the text itself that Jesus, as the God-man, we're dealing with God himself. God doesn't need any sort of formal human training in order to be taken seriously. He is God, and therefore his words hold true authority. Okay, and that's what we have here. And so as you continue on, in verse 16. It says, Jesus answered them, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. So in other words, it's my teaching comes directly from the Father. It comes from God. So the Jews' objection to Jesus is really, at the end of the day, an objection to God. Christ's teaching comes from the Father directly. Okay, and again, given that truth, he doesn't need any formal human training. Right? Given that truth, right? Okay, so really, you see just kind of their objection to Jesus shows all the more that their objection is also really an objection to God the Father himself, because God the Father is the one who brings about this teaching, and that's why Jesus can say, my teaching is not mine, but his who sent me. So and that's true. If Jesus is God, that's true. When you go back to even the things that we saw in John chapter 5, where Jesus says, I do only what the Father does, and that sort of thing, you see that God the Father and God the Son work and talk in tandem. You don't have one member of a member of the Trinity going one way and the other one going the other way, working independently. No, even when it comes to the right teaching, they say the same thing. So the same thing is laid out here. So when you get into verse 17, Jesus continues by saying, if anyone's will is to do God's will, he will know, the person who does God's will, he will know whether the teaching is from God or whether I am speaking on my own authority. Okay? So the one who seeks to do God's will, they will have the insight into the truthful source of Jesus's teaching. All right? So somebody who seeks to do God's will and goes in that direction, God will give them the light, give them the insight to see what is truly true, and give them the true insight of the source of that truth that's coming from Jesus's teaching. So this phrase also suggests that the Jews did not seek to do God's will, even though they may have thought that they did. And that shouldn't be surprising. We've kind of seen hints of that before in our study up to this point. Okay. Now in verse 18, he says, the one who speaks on his own authority seeks his own glory, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true, and in him there is no falsehood. So here, we're kind of getting in on the difference between those who seek the Lord and those who don't. Those who don't, namely and largely being, Jesus' Jewish enemies, as opposed to people like his disciples, for example, and the difference between those two. Those who speak on their own authority, those are ones who seek their own glory. Okay. And the one who seeks glory of the one who is sent is true. Now, here's the thing. This whole thing about seeking own glory and everything like that, it kind of has hints to what we've seen before in John chapter 5. Again, if you call your attention back to verse 44 of that chapter, where Jesus says, how can you believe when you receive glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the only God? So here we're seeing a repeat of things or hints of the same thing of what Jesus says before. And again, Jesus is one who's saying that those people who speak on their own authority, they're ones who seek their own glory. And this again shouldn't be surprising as well, just given the fact of what Jesus has said in other parts, and I'm thinking specifically in the Synoptics, in Mark chapter 12, and I just want to turn there and read this to you real quick. Mark chapter 12, and this is in verses 38 through 40. It says, and in his teaching he said, beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplaces and have the best seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. So there you see, just kind of what that looks like and how Jesus even describes what that looks like for people of that category. Okay, but in comparison to that, oppositely, where he says, but the one who seeks the glory of him who sent him is true. In other words, the one who seeks Christ and seeks his glory and seeks God's glory, he's the one who is true, and in him there is no falsehood, right? So in other words, and when it's saying that he's true and that there's no falsehood in him, it's not saying that, in this person's entire life they haven't told a lie or anything like that. It's just Jesus' way of saying that they are the true, genuine article. They're the real deal as it relates to true, authentic relationship with God and with Jesus Christ. It's non-hypocritical, unlike Jesus' enemies, okay? He's the genuine one. Now, this is similar, and you can look it up later, but again, if you go back to John chapter 1, verse 47, Jesus' words to Nathanael, here is a true Israelite in whom there is no deceit. It's kind of the same, it kind of goes along the same lines there, okay? So as we're coming closer to the end here, in verse 19 it says, has not Moses given you the law, yet none of you keeps the law? Why do you seek to kill me? So here Jesus is now is going to lay out and kind of gives a little bit of a specific example of the hypocrisy that's held with his enemies, and that's really what's being aimed at here, or at least in this section of the chapter. Here Jesus is going to expose the hypocrisy of his enemies, right? So he brings Moses back into the picture, which again, we know and understand, and we've talked about before how much Moses means to the Jews. Even, Jesus said in John chapter 5, he told them that Moses is the one on whom you set your hope. So Moses is obviously a very important figure in the minds of religious Jews here. But he says here that Moses gave the law, but he says that no one keeps the law. So here's how you can kind of look at this whole thing. You can look at it like this. If Moses and the law is so important to them, which they would claim to themselves and to other people that it is, if Moses and the law is so important to them, then they would keep the law, plain and simple. If it's that important, then they would keep the law. But Jesus is one who says that they don't keep the law. Now, here's the thing. They accuse Jesus of not keeping the law, right? And you can go to the specifics of, hey, he doesn't keep the Sabbath and that sort of thing. But the reason why they're going against him is, they accuse him of being a lawbreaker. So they accuse Jesus of not keeping the law, yet they don't keep it themselves, thus revealing themselves as hypocrites. You see how that works there? So Jesus is about to expose their hypocrisy here, especially as it relates to the accusative finger that they point at him as somebody who's a wrongdoer. So their hypocrisy is demonstrated by their seeking to kill him. And that's what he says there. That's why he says, has not Moses given you the law, yet none of you keeps the law? Why do you seek to kill me? So straight up, they're saying, why are you seeking to murder me? So if you guys are keeping the law, then why are you seeking to kill me? Which, that killing, or you can say murder, it would be the same thing in this case, would be breaking the law. So even while they think they keep the law that's so important to them, and they point to Jesus and saying he's the one who breaks the law, they're seeking to break the law. They don't keep the law, and they seek to break the law by saying, why do you seek to kill me? Actually, the law's already been broken. Actually, if you think about it, go back to Matthew chapter 5. They may not have actually taken Jesus' life at this point, but their desire is to take Jesus' life. So even there, they've already broken the law. So their hypocrisy is exposed by that question, why do you seek to kill me? Why do you seek to murder me? Okay. And so that's the thing. Now, notice here in verse 20, the crowd answered, "You have a demon who is seeking to kill you." Now, some people might look and they say, we've been talking about the Jews, and now here in verse 20 is the crowd. The crowd is kind of different. They might not be saying this in an aggressive sort of manner. I would say maybe they are a little bit, but I mean, even when we're talking about the crowd separated from this other class of Jews who are more out there as far as Jesus' enemies are concerned, even if we are to say that the crowd is of a different mindset, maybe it's a slightly different mindset. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're innocent, because while you might have some people within there who have a good thoughts about Jesus and things like that, you have other people who come from Galilee who would be part of this crowd, or even people in Judea part of this crowd, who have their misgivings about Jesus. I mean, even in the north in Galilee, as we saw in chapter 6, you had a lot of people who were favorable towards him at first, but then they turned their backs on him. Many of those people might be part of that crowd too. So, even though it says the crowd and not the Jews, thus maybe talking about a different set of people at the same scene, I would say that it doesn't necessarily mean that they're innocent either. But they say that you are demon. He says that you are demon possessed, and so they're essentially calling him crazy. He says, "You're crazy. You're out of your mind." And this isn't the first place that you're going to see this whole thing of Jesus and him being assigned as somebody who's demon possessed. But you're going to see that in a couple places in John chapter 8, but even in chapter 10 and in verse 20, just to give you an idea, it says, "Many of them said, 'He has a demon and is insane. Why listen to him?'" So there you get an understanding of them using this whole thing of demon possessed in relation to Jesus and saying that he's crazy, he's out of his mind, he must have a demon of some sort, or some sort of thing. In other words, he's crazy, he's out of his mind. And so the crowd is saying, you have a demon who is seeking to kill you. Who is there that's who's seeking to kill you? We don't know who these people are. But really, they're hiding the truth of their desire to kill him, which again we saw a lot of people in Judea in chapter 5, verse 18. It says that they wanted all the more to kill him because he broke the Sabbath and because he was claiming to be equal with God. Right. So in response, in verse 21, Jesus answered them, "I did one work, and you all marvel at it. Moses gave you circumcision." And so again, here's Moses again. He says that, the guy that you hold in high esteem, Moses gave you circumcision. And then parenthetically, not that it was from Moses. So there again, it kind of exposes just kind of the hype that people put on Moses, giving him credit for things that really didn't come from Moses, right? Not that it is from Moses, but from the fathers. "And you circumcise a man on the Sabbath." So you see where Jesus is going here. So so here it says, the Jews were willing to quote unquote break the Sabbath by doing circumcision. If, circumcision happened to fall on the 8th day, that's because the 8th day was the day when the male child was circumcised. All right. And no one would have a problem with this. No one had a problem with this. So you have a baby and it's 8 days old, and on that 8th day, it happened to be the Sabbath, and he was circumcised on the Sabbath day. No one would raise any objection. No one would say, hey, don't you know it's the Sabbath and you should die and that sort of thing. Nobody would have any problem with that, because that's what everybody was doing as it related to circumcision. Circumcision on the Sabbath was acceptable in the eyes of the Jews, in the eyes of that culture. Verse 23, "If on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision so that the law of Moses may not be broken." So there again, you see, okay, so in the whole thing of doing this on the Sabbath, you circumcise so as to keep the law, right? So if on the Sabbath a man receives circumcision so that the law of Moses may not be broken, are you angry with me? Because on the Sabbath I made a man's whole body well. Notice the comparison there. That's quite the comparison, and it really puts Jesus' Jewish enemies in a very bad light, right? So Jesus exposes their hypocrisy even more, right? By saying that they sought to kill him, which again is breaking the law, for taking care of, listen, by taking care of a more serious matter with the cripple, because again, Jesus is making reference when he's talking about this whole thing of I did one work and you all marvel. He's talking about that whole thing that happened in chapter 5 when he healed the invalid. And the whole thing of them marveling, I think that's more of a matter of that, some people may have marveled at it, but again, some of that marveling at the miracle may have baked into that, may have been the fact that they marveled that he did it on the Sabbath. They marveled at the miracle, but not for the right reasons. They marveled at it because he broke the Sabbath. But here, what Jesus is saying there is, okay, you're seeking to kill me, which is against the law, and you're wanting to kill me for taking care of a more serious matter with the cripple. Because again, making as Jesus termed it here, I made a man's whole body well. Okay, so here's somebody who's crippled. Okay, now compare that to circumcision. We're dealing with a bodily malady that, by the way, this person was suffering through for 38 years. Compared to circumcision, there really is no comparison, and that just shows you how warped their thinking was, and how that warped thinking, just kind of, played into how they saw things with Jesus in a wrong way, and where they really wanted to kill him in all of this. It reminds you, again, if you turn your attention back to Mark, I just want to read this real quickly, and then before we close, just to give you an idea, in other places in the Gospels where we see this, remember the whole Sabbath controversy in Mark chapter 3. You actually have one incident at the end of Mark chapter 2, and then at the beginning of Mark chapter 3 you have another one, but that second one in chapter 3 is what I want to focus on here. See if you notice the similarities here in chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. It says, again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand, and they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath. So they knew that he would heal, essentially, is what you're saying there, and they're watching for him to do it, to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. So they didn't have the best of intentions in mind here. Verse 3, and he said to the man with the withered hand, come here. And he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath, listen, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill? It's interesting that he puts it in that way. Healing is a good thing. It's a good deed towards another fellow man. And Jesus is saying, is it wrong? Is it against the law to do a good deed for somebody else on the Sabbath, which healing this man would have done? You see how he framed it there to make them look really, really bad, and rightfully so. But they were silent, and he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. Now listen to this, verse 6. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. So see, there's nothing new here. There's nothing new here. Even when he was doing good, when he did a good work on the Sabbath in that passage in Mark chapter 3, same thing that he did. I mean, not the same situation, but I mean, the same thing of doing good for somebody on the Sabbath in John chapter 5. And yet people want to kill him. Does that not smack of hypocrisy? It absolutely does. And so Jesus says in verse 24, do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment. In other words, so he says, not by appearances, you don't judge by appearances, but you judge rightly. And I think in brackets in your own mind, you can say that's based on truth. Judge based on truth. You judge based on truth, you're going to judge rightly and correctly. The thing is, that's not what these people were doing. And so, as a result, their hypocrisy is exposed. Okay, so we're not at the end here of just this back and forth that we see between the crowd. And really what we're going to see, we'll leave it here for now, but what we're going to see as we continue on in John is that as Jesus continues to speak, there's actually, a bit of confusion about who Jesus is. And so, some people have one thing to say and some people say another. Some people believe this about Jesus and they say, well, could this be the Messiah because we know where he's from and that sort of thing. Jesus is going to talk about all of that. But in the midst of that, you have his enemies who try and do him in. They try and arrest him. But even the people who are sent out, and this isn't going to be next time, this is probably going to be the time after that, they come back and say, nobody has spoken like this man. So we see somebody who is no ordinary man. We're dealing with God in human flesh, and God in human flesh, who can do no wrong and does no sin, even though people accuse him of it, turns around and says and points to them and lays out their hypocrisy and says, you guys are the ones who do not keep the law. So a lot of other good things that are in store. I hope you stay with us and hope you come back for next time when we continue to look at John chapter 7. But for now, we'll leave it there. If you enjoy this program and you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show. Follow and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast. Also follow me on X. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And also to order a copy of my book, Signs of the End, What Did Jesus Say About His Own Return, and the events that point to it. Links are provided in the episode description. All right, friends. Well, I certainly enjoyed this time that we had together looking through God's Word. I hope you had a good time as well. My name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time. Bye now.